In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before. Not during a world war, not during a massive battle, but in complete silence, behind closed doors, over 13 days when a single decision could have erased civilization. Most people never knew how close it truly was. For 13 days in October 1962, humanity lived on borrowed time. Children went to school, people went to work, cities glowed at night. But behind the routine of everyday life, the world stood on the edge of total destruction. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two most powerful nuclear states in history, were preparing for a confrontation that neither side could truly control. Nuclear weapons were armed, bombers were fueled, submarines disappeared beneath the oceans carrying weapons capable of ending millions of lives in minutes. This was not a distant threat. This was not theory. This was real. By 1962, the Cold War had already shaped an entire generation. People had grown up with air raid sirens, civil defense drills, and fallout shelter signs on city streets. In American schools, children practiced hiding under desks as if thin wooden furniture could protect them from a nuclear blast. In the Soviet Union, the fear was just as real. Cities were mapped, targets were planned. Both sides lived with the understanding that the next war would not be fought with soldiers alone, but with entire populations at risk. Yet even with all this tension, most people believed there would always be time to negotiate, time to step back. They were wrong. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba. What it photographed shocked Washington. Hidden among the forests and fields of the island were Soviet missile sites, long-range nuclear missiles capable of reaching major U.S. cities within minutes. New York, Washington, Miami, Chicago. The flight time for these missiles would be less than 15 minutes. For the first time in history, the United States faced the reality that nuclear destruction could arrive with almost no warning. This was not Europe. This was not Asia. This was 90 miles from Florida. When President John F. Kennedy was shown the photographs, everything changed. There was no longer room for gradual escalation or symbolic gestures. Every hour mattered. If the missiles became operational, the balance of power would shift overnight. The United States would be living under a permanent nuclear gun pointed directly at its heart. Kennedy understood something crucial. Once the missiles were ready, removing them would be nearly impossible without war. And war, in this case, meant nuclear war. Military leaders demanded action. Airstrikes, an invasion of Cuba, total destruction of the missile sites. From a purely military standpoint, these options made sense. But Kennedy saw the larger picture. An attack on Cuba would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel. That would demand a Soviet response. Berlin would be next, then Europe, then nuclear weapons. Once the first nuclear missile was launched, there would be no turning back. The terrifying truth was this: no one knew how to stop a nuclear war once it began. While politicians argued, the military moved. American naval forces surrounded Cuba in what was officially called a quarantine. In reality, it was a blockade, an act of war under international law. Soviet ships were already heading toward the island. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, Soviet submarines moved silently. Some carried nuclear torpedoes. Their commanders had limited communication with Moscow. They did not know the full situation above water. Depth charges exploded around them, warning signals from U.S. ships. Inside the submarines, temperatures rose, oxygen dropped. Men fainted, nerves broke. One order, one misunderstanding, that was all it would take. What made the Cuban Missile Crisis truly dangerous was not ideology or weapons, it was people. Men under pressure, men making decisions with incomplete information. Men trying to interpret enemy intentions through fear and suspicion. History often focuses on leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev. But the fate of the world also rested in the hands of submarine officers, radar operators, pilots, and commanders who had seconds to decide whether what they saw was an attack or a mistake. And mistakes happen, especially in moments like this. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Cuban Missile Crisis is this. Most of the world had no idea. There was no internet, no instant news alerts, no live coverage of emergency meetings. People sensed tension. Headlines grew darker, speeches more cautious, but the true scale of the danger was hidden. Humanity stood at the edge of extinction, quietly. The world was now trapped between two impossible choices: act and risk nuclear war, wait and accept permanent nuclear vulnerability. There was no safe option, only less catastrophic ones, and behind it all stood a decision made in secret, a Soviet gamble that had brought the planet to the brink. In the next part, we uncover why the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and why this crisis may have been inevitable. The missiles in Cuba were not an accident. They were not a defensive mistake. They were a calculated gamble made by one man who believed the Soviet Union was losing the Cold War, and time was running out. By the early 1960s, the nuclear balance between the United States and the Soviet Union was dangerously uneven. The United States possessed hundreds of long-range nuclear missiles capable of striking the Soviet Union. Many were stationed close to Soviet borders in Turkey and Italy, where flight times to Moscow were measured in minutes. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had far fewer reliable intercontinental missiles. Its nuclear forces existed, but they lacked flexibility, speed, and survivability. From Moscow's perspective, this was not deterrence, it was vulnerability. For Nikita Khrushchev, the situation was deeply personal. The Soviet leader had already suffered public embarrassment. The failed Berlin Ultimatum, the growing American influence in Europe, and, most painfully, the failed US-backed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, which revealed both American aggression and Soviet weakness. Cuba survived, but only barely. Khrushchev feared the United States would try again, and next time succeed. Cuba offered something the Soviet Union desperately needed: proximity. 90 miles from the American coast, the island provided a chance to do what the United States had already done to the Soviet Union: place nuclear weapons close enough to eliminate reaction time. From Khrushchev's perspective, this was not escalation, it was symmetry. The plan was bold, almost reckless. Secretly transport nuclear missiles, bombers, and thousands of Soviet troops to Cuba. Build launch sites under camouflage, complete deployment before the United States noticed. Once operational, the missiles would protect Cuba from invasion, restore strategic balance, and force the United States to negotiate from a position of equality. Khrushchev believed the Americans would accept the new reality, just as the Soviets had accepted US missiles in Turkey. He was wrong. The operation relied on secrecy. Missiles were shipped disguised as agricultural equipment. Troops wore civilian clothing. Construction was hidden beneath palm trees and nets. Even many Soviet officers were not told the full scope of the mission. Speed was everything. If the missiles became operational before discovery, the world would wake up to a new balance of power, irreversible without war. Khrushchev underestimated one critical factor: John F. Kennedy. He believed the young American president was weak, shaped by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and domestic political pressure. Khrushchev assumed Kennedy would protest, but ultimately accept the missiles to avoid war. What Khrushchev did not fully understand was that nuclear weapons change everything. Public acceptance was impossible. The missiles had to go. When the U-2 photographs revealed the missile sites, the Soviet plan collapsed overnight. What was meant to be a quiet strategic shift became a global crisis. Khrushchev now faced a nightmare scenario: remove the missiles and appear weak, or keep them and risk nuclear war. Neither option had been part of the original plan. The Soviet Union was now trapped by its own strategy. Every delay increased the risk of American action. Every concession threatened Soviet credibility. And worse, communication between Washington and Moscow was slow, indirect, and dangerously unclear. Letters crossed oceans while military forces moved in real time. The margin for error shrank by the hour. Both sides had made rational decisions from their own perspective. Both believed they were defending themselves. And yet, step by step, these rational choices pushed humanity closer to annihilation. This was the true danger of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not madness, but logic without limits. By late October 1962, the crisis had reached its most dangerous phase. Missiles in Cuba were nearly ready. American forces were on high alert. Soviet ships approached the blockade. The next move would not be symbolic. It would be irreversible. In the next part, we entered the most dangerous days of the crisis, when a single mistake nearly triggered nuclear war. The world did not come close to nuclear war once during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It came close multiple times. And in several of those moments, survival depended not on leaders, but on individuals who refused to follow protocol. October 27th is remembered as Black Saturday. It was the most dangerous day in human history. By this point, both the United States and the Soviet Union had their nuclear forces on high alert. Bombers were airborne, missiles were fueled, submarines were in position. Any false alarm could become fatal. That morning, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba. Soviet air defenses detected it. Orders were clear. The aircraft was shot down. The pilot, Rudolf Anderson, was killed. This was a direct act of war. In Washington, panic spread through the ex-com, Kennedy's inner circle. The military demanded immediate retaliation, airstrikes, invasion, total escalation. Kennedy hesitated. He understood something vital. The order to shoot down the plane may not have come from Moscow. This revealed the terrifying reality of the crisis. Control was slipping. Local commanders now had the power to trigger global catastrophe. Decisions were being made in seconds without confirmation from political leaders. The chain of command was breaking under pressure. And worse, neither side knew how close the other was to launching nuclear weapons. Beneath the Caribbean Sea, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was running out of oxygen. American destroyers surrounded it, dropping depth charges as warning signals. Inside the submarine, the crew believed war might already have begun. What the Americans did not know was this: the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. To launch it, approval was required from 3 officers. 2 agreed. 1 refused. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov believed the explosions were not an attack, but a signal. If he had agreed, a nuclear torpedo would have been launched at an American fleet. The United States would have responded. The chain reaction would have been unstoppable. One man said no. The world survived. As these near catastrophes unfolded, communication between Washington and Moscow remained dangerously slow. Messages took hours. Interpretations differed. At one point, 2 contradictory letters arrived from Khrushchev, one conciliatory, one aggressive. Which one represented the true Soviet position? Choosing the wrong response could end the world. Inside the White House, the pressure on Kennedy reached its peak. Military leaders argued that delay only made things worse. They believed nuclear war was inevitable and that the United States should strike first. Kennedy disagreed. He feared that once violence began, no one would be able to stop it. History would not be shaped by victory. It would be shaped by extinction. What neither side fully understood at the time was just how many nuclear weapons were already in Cuba. Some had already been placed under the control of local commanders. If the United States had invaded the island, tactical nuclear weapons would almost certainly have been used against American troops. The invasion plans assumed conventional resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. By the end of Black Saturday, a plane had been shot down. A nuclear torpedo had nearly been launched. Both superpowers stood minutes from disaster. The crisis had escaped careful planning. Now it depended on restraint, luck, and courage. The Cuban Missile Crisis was no longer about power or ideology. It was about survival. Behind the scenes, secret channels opened. Messages were rewritten. Compromises were quietly prepared. Publicly, both sides appeared strong. Privately, they searched desperately for a way out. In the next part, we revealed the secret deal that ended the crisis and why the world never heard the full truth for decades.